Welcome to webinar 5 on our evidence-informed approaches to English medium reading. And today we're looking at how we bring together the different strands of Scarborough's reading route into building a rigorous reading curriculum. Could you go to the next slide, please, Gordon? So as you can see, there are the strands that we've covered over our different webinars. And today it's thinking about how do we bring these things together strategically in our curriculum offer. On to the next slide, please, Gordon. So Curriculum for Wales Guidance states that a curriculum is defined as everything a learner experiences in pursuit of the 4 purposes. So we need to consider what we teach, and this would be our deliberate text selection and our phonics scheme, how we teach it, and why we are teaching this way with this content. So on the next slide, there are some reflection questions. And I just want to take a moment for you to read those reflection questions and think about where would you say your school or setting is with these questions? Are these things that you've thought about? Or are there some questions there that maybe you haven't yet considered as a school or as a class teacher? I'll just give you a minute or two to read through those. And then on the next slide, we want us to consider what your evidence base is for designing your reading curriculum. So when designing your reading curriculum, have you started with the why? Have you taken the time to find out about the reading experiences your school delivers? So the attached Microsoft form there was something actually used by one of our schools that's presenting today when we started working with Pencoed. They wanted to explore the reading behaviours of pupils prior to making changes to their curriculum, because knowing your why, really understanding your current provision, means that you're in a much better place then to plan from. So over the next few slides, we're going to explore different types of reading experiences that, when brought together collectively, add rigour and variety to our curriculum for reading. So the next slide talks about silent reading. And of course, it's going to come as no surprise to you that silent individual reading forms one of the types of readings we would want to see in a curriculum after a child has become a fluent decoder. Silent reading is how many of us read on a day-to-day basis in real life. And of course, you can see on the screen there the benefits to reading silently. But what about those limitations? I'm sure we can all think of a time when we've set some silent reading, and it's not really clear to what extent the pupils are actually reading. And of course, we may have concerns that our weakest readers struggle, and they may be making mistakes with reading that we can't see or hear. So what are the strategies we can put in place around this to address those limitations and drawbacks? Well, the first thing we need to do is think about, are we thinking strategically about where we place silent independent reading in our learning cycle? Could the pupils perhaps be reading a section of text that they have encountered before? Are we setting them a realistic amount of text and using the principles of gradual release so that we can carefully monitor focus and comprehension with silent reading? Are we also perhaps setting the pupils a focused task or a focused question to think about whilst they're reading, which could help keep the learners on task? And the next slide, or the next type of reading that we want to consider, is a different reading experience. This is when the teacher reads aloud to the pupils. If you could scroll on, Gordon. You can see from the bullet points on the screen that Estin and independent research on reading agree that the benefits of reading aloud to pupils are really significant. And yet, as children get older, this is something we tend to see less of. And in fact, in the 2021 thematic by Estin, it was pointed out that actually, even in lower key stage 2, this is something that happens infrequently. So let's move on now to consider the benefits of reading to learners. Well, firstly, you as the teacher are the most expert reader in the room, and you have that opportunity to role model reading effectively. You can use tone, you can use intonation in your reading to really bring it to life. It also allows pupils to engage in challenging texts and a wide range of literature that perhaps they couldn't read independently. I'm sure you've all had the experience of reading to a class where they're hanging on your every word, and that reading as a whole class can really foster that social and emotional connection to a text, and it can help develop that sense of community. And actually, most importantly, Reading to pupils provides equity of experience, which allows all of the learners then to participate in analysis and discussion related to the text. So alongside reading silently, we would hope to see some reading aloud to pupils form part of your reading curriculum. And now we're moving on to the next strategy, which is actually learners reading aloud. Now, if you cast your time back to when you were in school, I'm sure you can all remember being sat there waiting for your turn to read the section of a book that was maybe allocated to you. If you were anything like me, you would have worked out which sentence was yours and scanned ahead to that and not really be listening until you got to your turn to read. Many of us would be waiting in dread, and actually others would be really eager and keen to read aloud. And I think it's important to note that as practitioners, our own experiences of being asked to read aloud can actually really influence whether or not we ask children to do it, for how long we ask them to do it, and how often. And in the book there, The Fluent Reader, you can see the quote about round robin reading, where one student reads orally at a time. Ideally, while that student reads, the other students follow along silently in their books. But typically this is not the case. Knowing that they will be called to read upon in the lesson, students often look ahead to scout out what they may be asked to read. And what we want, is this what we want our learners to be doing? And does this approach aid comprehension? I'm sure we'd all agree that the answer to that one is no. So actually, what does the evidence tell us? If we could move on, Gordon. You can see from the screen that evidence tells us that reading aloud is a really, really important step in developing fluent readers. And we all know that fluency aids comprehension. So we need to think about how we can strategically manage this so we don't alienate learners and we don't make our weaker pupils feel more vulnerable. So just as with the silent reading, the section of text used for a pupil read aloud may be a text that they've encountered before. Perhaps you have even read it to them. To avoid it being predictable, you're not going to organise your readers to go in seat allocation. And you as the teacher will plan really carefully who is going to read what section, so that you're planning for pupils to experience success at reading aloud, not to experience any kind of failure. You may have let a nervous or a weaker reader know which section you're going to ask them to read ahead of time, and you may have even been able to work with them to practice that so that they can still be really involved in that collective activity. We can also start to normalise reading aloud by asking pupils just to read the title off the board, to read the learning objective, or to read a question. So we're slowly sensitising them to reading aloud in front of their peers. If we can move on to the next slide. So you can see we've covered the different types of reading experiences that you would want to see as part of the curriculum. But what about the texts themselves? You will have heard over the last few weeks that some of our schools presenting have really carefully considered text selection. And often when Gordon and I are delivering Read and Reconsider training, one of the most interesting conversations we have is on text selection. The conclusion that many of the delegates come to is that actually they pick text based on how they relate to a topic or a theme. And potentially they're not really thinking about how the text is helping a learner progress with their reading. They're not really consciously thinking about how reading becomes progressively more challenging as they move through school. Perhaps as a school or even a cluster, you could consider undertaking an audit of text and actually try and map out what the difficulty or challenge is in your current reading curriculum. Remembering, of course, that text can be challenging in different ways. Yes, they can be challenging at a text level, potentially with a reading age, but actually symbolic text can be challenging, or we may have a narrator in a text that is unreliable, and that makes a text challenging. And so I'd like to share with you now the work of one cluster, if we move on to that slide, the Bro Morgannwg cluster. One cluster in our schools decided that actually they really needed to focus on this at a cluster level. They had this shared priority to improve reading standards across the schools, and they'd work together as part of the shared understanding of progression work in designing their curriculums as part of Curriculums for Wales. And they wanted to address any potential inequity in reading provision. So the school decided to agree on the use of one shared text for each year group from years 3 to 6. It is important to note that they did read other texts in their schools that were picked at a school or a class teacher level, but they did have this one text that was common across the cluster per year group. They then worked together to develop shared teaching materials for these texts, and they collectively shared the expertise they'd gained from joining Central South Consortium Professional Learning. Now, they really feel that this approach has raised the status of reading in their cluster, and it's also aided that academic transition for pupils in their cluster. If we move on to the next slide. So the key takeaway I want us to take from this section before we move on to some exciting input from our schools, that actually our reading curriculum needs to offer a blend of all of these approaches. There need to be opportunities for pupils to be read to, for pupils to read independently and silently with those accountability measures built in, for pupils to have opportunities to read aloud and to read for pleasure, but also for them to make progress with the types of texts that they read. By giving learners this blend of reading, we can maximise the benefits then from each of these approaches. If we move on to the next slide. So we're going to hear now from two colleagues from Pencoed, Ellie and Louise, who are going to take us through their approach to designing and delivering a reading curriculum. Over to Ellie and Louise.
Hi, thank you so much. So my name is Louise Clark, I'm assistant head teacher. Many guises throughout my school career, including literacy coordinator. So I've been working really closely with Ellie in terms of developing literacy across the curriculum. If we can go to the next slide, please. So just gives us some context of our school. We're a typical comprehensive school. We've got an increasing number of EFSM learners, so we are having a real focus on equitable learning experiences at the moment. Hopefully you'll see today in terms of what we are trying to do to develop learners in progression in reading and supporting our practitioners as well in becoming more confident and understanding the importance of reading across the curriculum as well. So if I can go on the next slide, please. So this really gives the overview of what myself and Ellie will be talking to you about. We're going to tag team this a little bit and go back and forth and give some examples. But yeah, we're very happy to be sharing with you. So thank you for asking. And I'm going to hand over to Ellie now, who's going to talk about developing a reading culture.
Yeah, so we can go to the next slide, thank you. So I'm Ellie, I'm literacy coordinator here at Pencoed Comp. This is my 4th year in the role. And when I first started, really the first sort of point for me, and the clear starting point was developing a reading culture. We noticed that when year 7s were coming up, that they loved reading, or many of them loved reading, and we just saw a dip in that. I don't know if it's because perhaps they were having less exposure to reading every day as they did in primary school, or they developed different interests when they come through the comp, but we definitely saw a dip in that love for reading, and so we wanted to make sure we developed a whole school culture of reading and reading for pleasure. So we've had a number of sort of whole school initiatives. At Christmas we do book raffles, so we ask staff to donate books, and we get so many staff donating books, and we give these out to all learners around Christmas time to focus on equity and to ensure that all learners have a book to go home with over the Christmas period with. You can see on the image below that we celebrate World Book Day. All of the staff are on board, they all dress up just to show the learners again that we're pushing reading for pleasure, and we should read for pleasure. We also had, last year we had Bookish come in, so when the Welsh Government were doing the free voucher for every book, we had a pop-up bookshop come in, and they provided a free book for every child. So yeah, we're doing lots to develop that love of reading. We have a book suggestions box in the library. We do know we're very lucky to have a library, and so we do try and utilise that as best as we can. We have a book suggestions box, and we do listen to learners. I don't know if on the bottom left you can see we've recently purchased a load of manga books. They absolutely love reading manga, and so we listened to that feedback of the learners, and we acted on what they wanted, and we purchased books that they want and they're actually going to read, and they fly off the shelf. So just really building in that love of learning, of reading. We do have a book in every bag policy. Parents are made aware of that at the start of year 7, that they have to have a book in their bag at all times. Again, we're lucky we do have a library, so learners are able to take books in and out, so that we do have that drop and read policy in school. So in any subject, learners can be asked to drop and read at any point. And as well as that, which leads nicely to the next slide, we do have our whole school library lessons. So even when I started the role, whole school library lessons were in place. Every fortnight, learners have an hour in the library in year 7 and 8, but really that has changed over time. So initially we had the learners would read silently for the hour, the teacher would go around, ask what they were reading, ask about the plot, ask about characters, etc. But when Consortia came in and we had a review, we did sort of agree that learners weren't always making progress with reading. We had the few that absolutely loved reading and they would read for that hour, but the ones that we really needed to be reading just weren't. They were staring at the same 2 pages for an hour. So we acted on that, and we actually introduced whole school or whole class library lessons where we now do group guided reading. So we have a set text in year 7, that's Thief by Mallory Blackman, and in year 8 they read The Giver by Lois Lowry. But what we wanted to make sure is we're giving them a rich diet in those library lessons. So there are the range of reading strategies used, which feeds in lovely to what Catherine was saying, making sure that they're using all 3 reading strategies. So we use Control the Game, where learners are asked to track and read the text. And then learners should be asked to read aloud, but this needs to be prepared by the teacher, and the teacher bridges the more complex sections of the text. They then use accountable independent reading, but we ensure, as you can see on the right hand side there, that there's a question or a focus that they're given to make sure that they're in a way held to account and that they are reading the text, not just when we ask them to meet us at the bottom of the page using that 2 minutes to think about something else, that they are held to account and that they are reading the information so they know they're going to be questioned on it. And then of course we have the teacher-led reading as well, where the teacher models the reading aloud, the vocabulary, the pace. So what we've done is for each chapter we have a set of questions that really challenge learners with inference, vocabulary acquisition, just so they're getting a rich diet when they are reading the text, and we are making the most of that hour a fortnight, because we would love to do it more, but obviously we have to get through the English curriculum as well. So that's where we're at with library lessons, and it's just lovely to hear the learners, when we tell them they have a library lesson, they literally cheer. They absolutely adore their library lessons. So they're working really, really well, and those guides are given to all teachers so that learners are having the same diet, and we're ensuring really equity with reading, that they're all getting that rich reading diet. So yeah, Louise, I think this one's over to you.
It is, thank you. So I'm going to talk about professional learning, and we came out really strongly with our professional learning with our recent Eston report. And for us, it's about enabling and empowering staff. So whilst we're ensuring that reading remains a priority and Ellie's developing that culture of reading, professional learning has got to run hand in hand with it to develop that collegiate responsibility and that ethos around the school. So from a strategic point of view, we are fortunate that as a senior leadership team, and always has done historically, has valued literacy and the importance of reading. So it's always been one of our whole school priorities, and always will do, to be perfectly honest. We're not looking at literacy developments as being a tick box. We've done it, we move on, we look at something else. Our work on reading will continuously be reviewed and refined based on the cohort of learners that are coming up to us and the community needs of the school as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in terms of our PLCs. Literacy, as I mentioned, and the focus on reading is on our school improvement plan, and as a result of that we have lots of strategic discussions about the development of reading and progression of reading. So just yesterday we have extended SLT meetings where Ellie and her cross-curricular colleagues attend our meetings, give updates, talk about progress, targets. We're having these conversations at all levels, so the leadership team is fully aware and buying in and driving from the top down as well. So we feel that's really important. In terms of professional learning, we are always grateful for anything that we can access from the consortia, and we've had some excellent opportunities. We've accessed the Writing Revolution training, but I think the game changer for us was doing the Reading Reconsidered and the follow-up training that was offered to us then. With the TLAC training, that has changed our school culture significantly, and we very much valued that, and then that has been disseminated then extensively through our professional learning programme. So within our professional learning programme, we have bespoke sessions based on the needs of the school, which we'll talk about later. But for example, there will be PL sessions on reading that will be run by Ellie, or perhaps people that we have seen excellent practice from when we're going around doing learning walks or lesson observations or professional dialogue. And all of those feed into that idea of ownership, that it's not just Ellie delivering PL, it's not just SLT, it's not just external organisations coming in. It's about that ownership as a school and the priority of it as a school as well. We've also been really successful with our PLC programs, our professional learning communities. We've run them in Pencoed for many, many years, and we're in so many different versions by now. But we have really focused and driven the idea of developing them as a literacy working party to engage all members of staff, all curriculum and all AOLE leads as well. So the PLC programme Ellie's going to share with you in a moment, but that has been really effective in really driving home our professional learning priorities and showing an impact on the learners in terms of progression and the provision that they're having in the classroom as well. So I'm just going to hand back over to Ellie, and if we can move on to the next slide, please.
Yeah, so as Louise said, our PLCs for the last 2 years have just been literacy focused. So we have 4 throughout the year, all an hour and a half long, and we are focused predominantly on reading. So I think the key thing for us was getting staff to buy into it and to understand how much reading impacts or how much they need reading in all subject areas. I think it's quite hard for staff sometimes when they're trying to get through the content of their courses to sort of understand that reading is at the core of that. On all exam papers, you need to be able to read, to decode, to understand what the questions are asking you. So we actually sort of, myself and the head of English, got all GCSE and exam papers together and looked at all the different reading skills. And when we showed them to staff in line with what some of our reading ages are in our school in year 11 and showed them the data, and that in fact we do need a reading age of 16 to understand some of the GCSE exam papers, we really got staff to buy into that. So we've been focusing predominantly on, at the moment, the reading skills. So we've shown and we've looked at the Scarborough's reading rope and looked at all the different elements required in order to really understand the text. In the most recent PLC, which was actually on the Monday just gone, we looked at how as a school we could ensure that we're providing background knowledge and teaching vocabulary explicitly and implicitly to learners to ensure that they are understanding texts. So that's where we're at the moment with the PLCs and the reading. But yeah, it was really important for us to get staff to understand why we were looking at reading as a whole school, to really get them to buy into it, and staff are really on board now and really enthusiastic about improving reading and reading skills. So yeah, I think Lou, it's over to you.
Yes, sorry, can we go back on the slide? Sorry. Thank you. So moving on then in terms of a roadmap of implementing the rigorous reading curriculum, going back to what Catherine was saying in the introduction, we've done a lot of work with the consortia. I'm very grateful for the support in terms of considering the why. And this goes back to sort of prior to when I was leading on literacy. We did a lot of work on looking at the sort of the blend of the book selections, the diet, so I'll talk about those in a moment. But what we really, something that Ellie and I really champion, is about making sure that the children are reading above their pay grades. We're very much, you know, making sure that learners are being pushed and challenged. So we're looking at making sure that when texts are being selected, we're looking at the reading ages, we're looking at suitability in terms of the maturity levels. But as Kath mentioned, it's not simply just sort of shoehorning something in because of the topic. It's about making sure that there is that progression, and it's making sure that the learners are not sort of reading something in year 8 that perhaps they've covered, or the type of level they would be having back in year 4 or year 5. So that progression is something that we are really driving forward at the moment. And I know Ellie's going to talk later about the work with the clusters to support that. But yeah, that's the one thing we've really worked hard on, is about the reviewing of the text, the diet of the reading. And I know Ellie's going to mention very briefly about Learner Voice before I come back to some of the work that's been done outside of the English department as well.
Yeah, so I was just going to come back to Learner Voice, and that we speak to learners quite a lot. We do a lot of learning teaching forums, and we did one a couple of weeks ago, and we talked a lot about reading. And they did say that something they got really frustrated with is when they don't read whole texts or text in their entirety. So when perhaps they start a text or they don't finish it, or when they just look at extracts from a text and they're really enjoying it. So that's something that we've been really conscious of when we've been planning for text across the curriculum, is making sure that learners are having the opportunity to be able to finish text and read text in their entirety, because it was something they were really passionate about.
So yeah, I'm going to carry on looking at the diet of reading as well. So the one thing, Ellie, I've had lots of conversation about is the diet of the reading in terms of the balance between fiction and non-fiction. So we do have departments within the school who have really run with the responsibility of developing reading. Within history, for example, we have implemented sort of scholarship academic books within many of our topics. You can see on the screen, we've got an image of The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. I think I should be on commission because I've recommended that book to so many different people by this point. But what we've done is we've used chapters, extracts, just sections of the book to really enhance the discussions about historiography, about equity, and looking at the role of women during the 19th century, and even looking at the role of women now in terms of Hallie Rubenhold as a historian and the response that she's had. And it's empowered so many fantastic discussions, and had we not put that in to supplement the work, we would have missed out on so much. And I think we've bought about 4 or 5 copies for the department regularly every academic year, because we're lending them out to children. We're not getting them back, but that's not the end of the world, because they're so engaged by it. So we've really tried to make sure that these the learners are being exposed to these types of texts at the age of 13, 14. They'd never go on Amazon and click on The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, because it wouldn't be available, or they wouldn't think it was appropriate for them. And I think from a history perspective, and I know in other humanities subjects as well, we are very conscious about the vocabulary. So I've talked about this in the past where, for example, as a history teacher, my class are studying the Elizabethan era. So when they have to read extracts or sources, they're looking at 16th century language. So we have to make sure that we are starting to introduce to them more sort of academic language further down the school to enable that transition of when they come up from year 9 into year 10. And that they're exposed to it and they're confident in how to decode, or how to use a Freya model, or how to go and find out what it means, or to use it in context. So we do have a lot of departments who are very much looking at how they can look at bringing in either fiction or non-fiction. RVE use Malala's biography. We have a lot of departments who are looking at the choice and the diversity of the books as well, because we did some work with Catherine on that a couple of years ago. So I think staff are much more mindful, and that sort of the intention of why we're reading, what we're reading, and then obviously, as we'll talk later, the how, the strategies and the approaches. Over to you, Elle.
Yeah, so I think the last 2 sort of bits of our roadmap here are change the lens to control the game. So learners are really engaged with this now. We have sort of built this culture, which we are going to come to, where it is just normal now for learners to know that they're going to use and control the game in any subject area, and that there is an expectation that if they are called upon, that they will read, and they will read aloud. And we have no children that ever say, no, I'm not reading, or I'm not willing to do it, because it's purposeful and it's planned. And that's something that we made really clear to practitioners, is that it does need to be prepared, that we can't be asking learners if they've got a reading age of 6 to read sentences with really difficult language in. So yeah, we've really changed the lens on that. And learners are transferring that knowledge. So they don't just associate reading aloud now with English. They know that they're going to use it in RVE. They know they're going to use it in literacy rich subjects, and they can certainly cite that, and they talk about it a lot when we speak to them. And then the final thing really there is the Freya model. We've really invested into explicit vocabulary teaching. So we predominantly use the Freya model. I think that's quite fitting, especially for subjects like science and maths, and it works really well for them. We sort of have a word of the fortnight initiative, where every subject, whether that's tier 2 or tier 3 vocabulary, every subject has a word of the fortnight, at least one word, where they use the Freya model to contextualise a word that will be in that unit of work or upcoming lessons, so that learners are constantly building on their vocabulary. And another one that we've also recently introduced is the define and apply grid, so it's just above the Freya model there. So we are using that as well, and I think that's useful if you're not just wanting to teach one keyword. If you are reading a text with a few words or pieces of vocabulary that are more challenging, then using the define and apply grid is really useful, and so staff are also utilising that now. So yeah, just really getting staff to buy into using those models, and that we're building that consistency across the school, and learners know that these are the strategies we use now to improve their reading. So yeah, So alongside the curriculum planning and the selection of texts and the reading across the curriculum. We're also using personalised assessments a lot to inform what reading strategies we're addressing with learners receiving intervention. So we use national reading tests, but we also use GL assessments as well. We're very fortunate that our schools have bought into that. And the GL assessments are excellent for us in allowing us to see the reading ages of learners, but it really breaks down for us what skills those learners need more help in, or what as a school we need to address in terms of reading skills and where learners need more help. And it also helps us, which it leads on nicely to what Louise is going to talk about now, it also helps us to identify those learners who need that intervention and that specific reading intervention. So GL assessments has been really useful for us.
Yeah, and we felt that it would be remiss of us not to talk about this in the presentation, because we've spent so much time developing a curriculum and empowering our staff that then, you know, how do we support those learners? How do we ensure the equity? So the one thing we're really proud of is that we have started to try and be a bit more innovative. And when we were looking at intervention programs, we used to use many years ago programs like BKSB. We tried different models such as Lexia, taking learners out in terms of certain subjects, but we just couldn't see any impact, and the learners weren't able to transfer any work they were doing within the interventions to their wider lessons and the wider curriculum experiences. And then we would think, well, why are we, it's going back to the question, why are we doing this? So there was a change in staffing. So our head teacher supported a proposition to employ an interventions teacher, and we've employed a primary practitioner who is now in her second year with us, and it's been one of the best things we've done, because that's allowed us to model reading interventions suitable for our school and our learners. So we're not following packages or paying into things that may not be suitable for us. It's about making it right for the Pencoed pupils who are sitting in front of her. It also means they're not being taken out of lessons, which could cause resentment and issues of well-being. So this particular member of staff is a member of the English and Maths team. She teaches at the same time as them, and she works with small groups of learners, and she's delivering the Maths and English curriculum, but obviously it is being differentiated and pitched to suit the learners in front of them. We've recently done some assessment in terms of impact, and we can see the impact she's had on chronological reading ages based on the baseline chronological reading age of where they were. In Maths, she's made a significant impact as well. And she's also then working with learners in terms of who are not quite fit in the current category for interventions in English and Maths. She's working with them on reading in registration sessions. That's been really important to us in terms of that enabling equity for all our learners. We go on to the next slide, please. So also then looking at equity for all, it's about then what's going on in the classroom. So Ellie and I are going to tag team this section a little bit, but to begin with, it's about making sure there's equity in the materials the learners have in front of them. There's no difference in different sets or bands about text that pupils have in front of them. There is a consistent approach to everything. And all learners in the English department, they receive the same diet of books as well, and the wider subjects have exactly the same approach. I don't know if Ellie, you want to talk about the vocab acquisition then?
Yeah, and again, ensuring there's consistency in the vocabulary that we give learners, and really making staff aware of the power of words and the subject domain vocab. So all departments engage in explicit vocabulary teaching. As I discussed, the Freya model is something that we've introduced, but in a recent literacy review we did actually just prior to Christmas, we saw that staff are teaching vocabulary in a number of ways now. There was a lovely lesson where a science teacher had ambitious vocabulary related to science, and learners had to find the definitions for those around the room. So just staff are naturally now looking at that ambitious vocabulary and in their own ways, as well as through the Freya model and the define and apply grid that we've introduced. They are all providing learners with equity, really, by providing them with rich vocabulary learning experiences and challenging vocabulary, and we do ensure that is for all. And those vocabulary and the key vocabulary is QA'd. So in every literacy review, the key vocabulary provided by AOLE leads, it's QA to ensure that learners are having that range of vocabulary and that range of tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary. So we do QA those processes, just to make sure that all learners are being challenged as well, and we're giving all learners that rich vocabulary.
Yeah, and then in terms of the pedagogy, you know, we're making sure that there's consistent approaches to pedagogy, there's a language for learning, and then that range of reading strategies, ensure those equitable learning experiences. And Ellie's done a lot of work with staff, as she's mentioned earlier, so I won't go into that into too much detail again, but having that sort of contextual understanding before they access the text, about making sure that we're showing them visual images, or we're explaining the context behind something. Ellie said a couple of weeks ago in professional learning, they don't know what they don't know, and I think that has really resonated with our staff. And we really now having a focus on building that cultural capital and making sure they have that exposure and that sort of awareness, because it is supporting them in understanding, reading for understanding, and that engagement as well. We've seen a big difference in many key areas.
Yeah, and I think another area for us in ensuring equity for all is the reading approaches. So I touched on those already when I was showing you the library group reading guide. But we have worked a lot on building those reading strategies. The control the game, we've created this no opt-out culture from the offset. When they come in year 7, we tell them this is what control the game is. You track the text. If I call your name, you read, and I'll bridge. And they know that is what's expected of them. So it's just building this no opt-out culture, but also they know it's okay to make mistakes. They know that it's okay if they read a word wrong, and they definitely feel comfortable in that reading environment now. So yeah, it's just been really working on building those reading approaches, and they do take time sometimes, especially things like accountable independent reading. It does take a while to train your learners to be able to do that and to be able to meet you at the end of a page or a paragraph and to be ready to be questioned on what they've read, but it definitely pays off in the long run.
So I'm going to talk in the beginning about progression, and I think some of the key things talked about lots of colleagues in different schools is, you know, what does progression look like? What is progression? And I think that's something we come back to again and again. But in terms of progression across the curriculum, we have mapped out reading opportunities, but I think our next step now is really looking at the progression. It's happening in pockets, but it's making sure we're mapping the progression with a view then of looking at our working with our clusters. And I think that's, you know, that's a natural next step for us. We've also looked at progression across the curriculum in terms of looking at within and across AULE working. We've got lots of subjects who would naturally lend themselves to supporting each other, to provide the context or to provide the opportunity for progression. So for example, we have in history, when the English department are working on sort of different types of poetry, we've stepped in and supported there. If we are looking at World War I, for example. Also, we teach, you know, 1920s, the Great Depression. So when the learners are looking at Mice and Men or the text linked to that period, they've got that contextual understanding. And I think that's worked really well, isn't it, Ellie?
Yeah, an example that always stands out for me is when we do Strange Fruit. When we're doing poetry from other cultures with our year 9. When we look at the poem Strange Fruit, they're able to make those links that they've learned in history straight away about racism in America. So yeah, it's working well. So yeah, another thing I think feeding into this that we've done a lot of work on is cluster collaboration. So just even that networking and discussing what do our learners need, what are they struggling with reading, and having those conversations is working really well for us, and the sharing of professional learning opportunities, and also the common language for learning. I know a lot of our clusters now are trying to use the same vocabulary as us, things like control the game and tracking, so that when they come to us, they've already got that understanding of what is expected of them. So we met in the summer of last term and we looked at writing, but I know for a lot of the clusters for our school now are working on reading. And we met 2 weeks ago, and we actually had Jasmine come and facilitate from CSE and facilitate the meeting, and we looked at reading specifically as it was the cluster's priorities. And we sort of came up with just a few small strategies that we've all come to agree to use just to ensure progression. So we've done an inference grid that we're all going to use consistently to develop the use of inference skills. And again, looking at implicit vocabulary teaching, so the boxing of key vocabulary. So we're trialing strategies that we're using across the clusters to develop reading. And when we finish our PLCs at the end of this academic year, then we're going to look at mapping our reading and our reading opportunities across the 3 to 16 continuum when we've got that, because we need to map it with us first, and then we're going to meet with the clusters in summer and then map it from 3 to 16.
I think that links in with the final bit on this slide about progression mapping. So that's the outcome of the PLC. We've used the consortia rubrics to support us in terms of self-evaluating. That's been really useful across literacy, numeracy and DCF. That's been really helpful. And we've also signed up for a comparative judgment trial. And we will then be using that then in terms from a literacy point of view to support us seeing what does progression look like, and therefore how are we going to map it. So if I can move on to the penultimate slide. So we just wanted to share with you about, whilst we're developing this rigorous reading curriculum, how are we then checking, how are we making sure that standards are maintained, how are we ensuring that our non-negotiables are in place. So on this slide is just a range of the different things that we do as a school, and to demonstrate as well the strategic importance that literacy and specifically reading has. All of these provide us with first-hand evidence and to make sure that we're evaluating the provision and also the impact of it as well. So I know Ellie's just going to give a few examples now of what she's done from a literacy point of view.
Yeah, so we tend to do two this year. We're doing 2 literacy reviews. So we do one in the autumn term, one in the summer term, and we use a range of self-evaluation and quality assurance processes. So we use live learning and learning walks. So we'll walk into lessons for maybe 15-20 minutes as opposed to staying for the whole hour, and that just allows us to see a wide range of subjects and what's happening with reading across the school. We use learning and teaching forums. It's invaluable listening to the learners and what they think that is working well and what they need help with. Is another thing that we use, and we use all this really to evaluate the provision and the impact on progression. The use of having 2 is that we sort of identify lines of inquiry. In the first one, we feed back to AOLEs individually, so we give more subject-specific feedback, because we were finding when we were giving generic feedback, it wasn't always fit into all AOLEs. So we give specific feedback to different AOLEs, and then we give time for them to sort of enact on that and act on what we've proposed. And then we do a second literacy review where we use the same QA processes to ensure or to make sure that departments are acting and doing what we've said to continue to improve reading across the school.
And then our last slide, thank you. So we were visited by Eston at the end of September, and as nerve-wracking as it was, we were delighted with our outcomes, and also that we could see we're on the right track in terms of our skills development and the implementation and provision. We've got a clear recommendation, which we've already started working on. And we're also, we're all working really hard then in terms of sort of sharpening that self-evaluation. We were talking quite a bit today, we're changing the lens, and that's exactly what we're doing then in terms of our recommendation too. So I think we are done. So thank you for listening to us, and thank you for the opportunity. And if there's any questions later, we can answer, hopefully.
Thank you both, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So thanks to Louise and Ellie. Really useful there to see how you brought all of those elements together. And now we have Emily Davis from RADA Primary joining us to talk through their approach to designing a reading curriculum. Over to you, Emily.
Hi. Well, listening to Pencoed talking, it's sort of we've sort of taken a similar approach, but we're not quite as far along the journey as they are. So if we go to the next slide, please. We are situated on the outskirts of Cardiff, so we're a relatively big primary school with 2 form entry, with morning and afternoon nursery right up to year 6. And historically, we've sort of reading is something that has sort of been a strong sort of area within the school. But having said that, it's something that you can't forget, and it's something that is, like sort of Pencoed said, on the sort of self-evaluation process, and the SIP is sort of something that we keep going around and revisiting to make sure that we are providing what we think we're providing for our learners, and making sure that our vision, that they're unlocking the potential in every child, that everyone is getting the sort of, they mentioned the rich diet, the good experiences, all of those sort of things. So if we go to the next slide, we started off so we're looking at our reading journey, and sort of the one thing we started off with was the culture. So if we go to the next slide, please. And we went back to what our vision was, and we went back to what we wanted for our learners. And I had lots of conversations with the whole staff, like, were we doing what we could to make sure we were unlocking the potential for every pupil? or was there pockets of learners then that weren't reaching their potential because the reading curriculum wasn't suitable for them? So we very quickly sort of started with them with creating the love of reading and trying to bring that back. So we sort of felt that over the years we did do really good things, and as the years sort of went on and the priorities changed, and then we sort of lost that a little bit. So we very much brought that back in the focus, and it's been the focus now sort of for the last couple of years. So if you go on to the next slide, please. And we started auditing reading. So we recognized having, lesson observations, learning walks, speaking to staff, speaking to learners, all those processes, that we felt that we had a very systematic phonics scheme that was working for the learners from reception up to year 2. We had guided reading in place, but having spoken to the learners and staff, we felt that there was pockets of really, really good practice, and then pockets then where things weren't working as well. So that sort of quickly became something that we were going to focus on, was the guided reading. We were quite confident in the reading opportunities that the children experienced, that we were offering lots of things, but there was still more that we could do. And then we did have a range and progression of reading material that I've been on a course a couple of years ago with Helen Bowen, and we'd looked at that and we'd sort of mapped it, but it sort of felt like at the time we weren't planning for it. We were just sort of looking at the texts we were using and sort of putting them in the box. So it wasn't a very sort of well planned reading curriculum for progression. It's that we were trying to sort of cover the range, but not looking really whether the texts that we were using were actually allowing the children to make progress within their reading across the school. So it's sort of like an ongoing process of self-evaluation that's been sort of going on for the last couple of years now, and we're sort of still in the middle of it. We're trying things, we're monitoring it, we're evaluating. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So I talk about the sort of the opportunities that we were offering for learners. Sort of to take a sort of step back and have a refresh, we sort of put reading back out there as a massive priority for staff, for learners, for the community, making sure that we were all doing a really big push on it. So staff made sure that the children had really high quality reading environment set up in every classroom, which previously we did a library set up. That space had been used for something else then, so we were sort of making sure then that because the library had gone, did the children have that access to the high quality reading environments? Were there high quality books in there? We were sort of making sure there was a variety, audiobooks, magazines, listened to the learners about what they wanted, and we had some funding from the PTA then. We went out and bought new things for the children, because we were sort of finding that sort of the love of reading was sort of dipping off as we were getting to the top of upper key stage 2. So there was always children, like I was teaching in year 6 at the time, so there was always children who were really keen to read. There was always a group of learners, so it was a real struggle to try and get them on board. So we sort of started some of these initiatives to try and really get them on board. And what was really successful, sort of the upper key stage learners, was setting up the reading buddies, where they were reading with younger learners in the school, and that was really successful. And the audiobooks is just something that I don't suppose we'd really considered before, but they've turned out to be vastly popular and everyone loves it. Visits from Welsh authors and things, just putting it out on the map and trying to get the community involved where we can. The next slide, please. So we were planning for progression, and sort of over the last couple of years we've worked really closely with the cluster primary schools and secondary schools to plan the whole sort of literacy curriculum. And sort of this is just like a extract from the reading curriculum, and sort of agreed with all schools sort of the language that we would use, the experience that the children should have offer to and access to, and then sort of there was a discussion then on the sort of texts that should be planned for. Now I just gotta say that I've been on maternity leave for the last year, so I'm just sort of only come back in January, so I am catching up on all these little bits and bobs. So when I went off last year, it was sort of mentioned about the text that were going to be used, but that's not something that had currently sort of been planned for across the curriculum, but that was something that we were coming back to do. Because a lot of the schools in the cluster had taken part in the Read and Reconsidered program, and at that time I hadn't. So this was sort of put in the plan for progression across the cluster schools, but I was sort of lacking in the knowledge and understanding of it. So that's when then I undertook the Read and Reconsider training, which if I go on to talk now on the next slide, to talk about some of the things that we've done with that then to change some of the things that we looked at. So thank you. So the training, so we already know we had sort of gaps in our sort of teaching and things that what we'd done when we'd done the sort of lesson observations and listening to learners and speaking to staff. And we sort of thought guided reading was something maybe that we could ensure that was a little bit sort of tighter, and we were making sure that, because it was really good pockets of really good practice, but making sure that everyone was clear and making sure that we had a really clear sort of approach to reading for new starter teachers as well, so making sure that everything was really clear, really obvious for staff, and they knew where to go. So obviously, like I said, I did the training, and coming back and speaking with staff, that we obviously realised there was tweaks and things we need to make, and we started off like looking at a list of non-negotiables of what we needed in the guided reading session. We spent a lot of time looking at the reading approaches and what we felt was beneficial, what that, like we discussed earlier, the benefits, limitations, and realised there's a place for everything, but were we doing it in the right way? Were we planning for it, or was it just sort of happening? So we made sure then that guided reading was a focus for all staff. So it was like especially from Key Stage 2 up, we did a lot of work on whole class guided reading. It was something I've been working on for a couple of years. And I had time for do some professional learning and development, where I was going into classes and modelling things, and they were coming in to watch me. And then lots of trialing different approaches and lots of trialing of different things. So we go on to the next slide, please. We sort of decided then, we started looking at the teaching approaches. So we looked at it from that element to start with, and to make sure that we were weaving in the blend of teaching approaches. So these are just some slides from some guided reading activities across sort of Key Stage 2. And what we were finding was that sometimes with the traditional, we'd had sort of carousel guided reading sort of set up, and it was lots of round robin reading going on, that there was a place for it. However, there was, I felt in year 6 sometimes, that not all children were accessing those high quality reading materials because they were being stuck on their reading level and their reading band, and then they weren't having the opportunity to have those discussions. Whereas I found that one particular year when I started this, there was a group of learners whose reading ages were young. They were sort of reading about 5-6 age level, sort of in year 6, but they understanding and the comprehension and their ability to have high depth conversations was incredible, but they weren't getting those opportunities because throughout their school time they've been sat in a reading group on Redbook or whatever it is, and they've just been reading around and they've lost that love. So it was sort of making sure then that we were planning for those opportunities for the children. So it was a lot of opportunities for staff reading to pupils, like paid reading, different things like this. So the one there with the extract, read from the top of page 8 to 12, that was an activity I tried in year 4 before I went off on maternity, and did the control the game. And like Pencoed said, like very well planned for, making sure that all the learners, so 30 children in the class at year 4, were able, and nobody complained. Everybody absolutely loved it because they knew what the expectation was. It'd been planned for so that the learners who had a lower reading age had something that was accessible. There was some children I'd read with prior, so they knew what was coming. And that's sort of been a strategy now that's been sort of embedded throughout Key Stage 2. And now I've come back and I'm in year 1. It's actually something I've tried with my sort of more able readers. And even at the age of 5, they have been absolutely brilliant at doing that, which has just sort of blown my mind. You know, historically, it's not something I would have ever tried to do. You can go to the next slide, please. So yeah, we sort of, like I said, we did the control the game, and then the accountable independent reading. There was pockets of independent reading, but like was discussed earlier, how much were they actually getting? How much did they actually understand? Were they actually reading, or were they just sort of flicking through the book or staring at the wall for the 20 minutes? So that has been planned for now, to give children sets of questions before the reading. So that's done in whole class guided reading, and there's still some group guided readings going on as well, where that is planned for. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm trying to whiz through it. And then the third sort of pedagogical principle that we sort of wanted to implement was the vocabulary. So again, we sort of felt that maybe we were wasting a bit of time on the vocabulary. First of all, we were making assumptions that children knew vocabulary that they didn't, and then maybe in some elements we were just sort of allowing them time to sort of find out what the words mean, and there is a place for that, but sometimes we were feeling like we were wasting a bit of time with that. So we've used, again, some of the strategies from the Read and Reconsidered, and different year groups are trying it in different ways. So like the refugee one worked really well with year 4, with your definition and the situation, and sort of the vocabulary then was highlighted at the start of the text so that they know what's coming up then, so you don't have to waste time then. You can have those discussions straight off then, they know and they understand what the sort of vocabulary is. So yeah, next slide, please. Oh, I've already discussed that one. Right, the last one, thank you. So we obviously, like I said, it's sort of a constant process, and we've sort of taken it from the sort of the pedagogical principles. We worked on the teaching of reading, specifically in the guided reading. We feel like that's going really, really well. It's sort of my role now, I've come back, is to go back in and observe and to check everything is happening that we think is happening. And by having spoken to learners since I've been back, seems like it's going really, really well. And there does seem to be a buzz and a love of reading around the school, which is noticeable coming in. But what we really needed to work on now is sort of the planning for the 5 parameters of reading. So making sure that the text selection is there. So we did have some funding a couple of years back for sort of buying more diverse books. So that's something that we looked at. But again, it's something now that we need to make sure that we are planning for the progression, planning for the range, and making sure that, like we said earlier, we're not just shoehorning texts because that's the topic. So that's sort of the next bit of the priority now, is so reevaluating what we've done so far. But my next sort of step then is we've got an inset coming up in March where we're going to look as a whole staff then and sort of look at what we've got. We've done a bit of an order of what texts we've got and sort of when they're being taught and those sort of things. But it's sort of now sort of developing that further to make sure that the children are getting the depth and the breadth that they deserve to have. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was really interesting. And I love what you were saying there about we may be doing some of these things, but it's the intentionality with which we do them, isn't it? It's the when and the how it comes in our learning cycle. So thank you so much for that. And I'd like to say thank you to all our presenters, to Ellie, Louise and Emily, for sharing with us today. Just so you are aware, our last webinar is next week, where we're looking at reading interventions. And you also can see on the screen at the moment the dates for our summer term cohort of Read and Reconsidered, which should be bookable next week. On the slide after that, you can see the dates for our professional learning on Words Matter, which is coming up in March. And of course, that's our PL on vocabulary instruction. And then we'll just end the session by sharing the evaluation form. I would really appreciate it if you could just take a couple of minutes to complete this. It's really helpful for us. It helps to shape our PL and know what you want moving forward and know what is and isn't useful for you. So if you could just take a couple of minutes to complete that evaluation form. I am now going to stop the recording, and if anyone wants to ask any questions at all, we can do so once I stop recording.